The January morning in 1918 arrived with a law written across the Dakota sky. Henry Garrett stood at his farmhouse window, 82 years old and sharp enough to recognize deception when he saw it. The thermometer outside read 42 degrees. Snow melted in patches across the yard. A warm breeze moved through the bare cottonwood branches like a whisper promising spring. His grandson James came down the stairs, 16 and eager, already dressed for school. The boy carried his books under one arm, no coat, no mittens. He'd left them hanging by the door. "Grandpa, I'm heading out. Weather finally broke." Henry turned from the window, his hands gnarled and missing two fingers on the left from frostbite 40 years past gripped the sill. He looked at James, really looked at him, saw himself at that age, saw all the certainty that comes before a man learns what his certainty costs. "James, sit down." The boy stopped confused. "Sir, sit down. I need to tell you about the day I killed children with my certainty." James's face went pale. In all his 16 years, his grandfather had never told this story. Everyone in the township knew pieces of it. Whispers about the children's blizzard of 1888, about Emma Hayes and the iron boiler, about the bodies they'd found. But Henry Garrett himself never spoke of it, until now. James sat at the kitchen table. Henry lowered himself into the chair across from him, bones creaking, joints protesting. Outside, the deceptive warmth continued. Inside, an old man prepared to confess. There are decisions a man makes in 30 seconds that he lives with for 30 years. Henry began. His voice carried the weight of decades. "This is the story of the worst decision I ever made, and the 11-year-old girl who saved me from having to live with even more death than I deserved." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the clock and the whisper of that warm lying wind. Henry closed his eyes and went back 30 years. Back to another January morning that felt exactly like this one. Back to when he was 52 years old and knew everything. Back to the day the wolves chased the sun. The sun rose on January 12, 1888, over a landscape that had spent 2 weeks trying to kill everything that lived on it. Henry Garrett woke at 6:30 that morning in the farmhouse he'd built with his own hands 9 years earlier. He dressed in the dark, careful not to wake Martha, though he knew she was already awake. His wife always woke when he did. After 23 years of marriage, their rhythms had synchronized like the gears in a watch. He went to the window first. Always the window first. A farmer's morning began with reading the sky, and Henry Garrett considered himself an expert reader. What he saw stopped him cold. 40 degrees, maybe more. Snow melting. The previous night had been 20 below. The week before that, colder still. They'd lost 2 calves to the cold. The Sorensen family 3 miles east had lost their milk cow. Children had stayed home from school for 6 straight days because the cold was simply too dangerous. And now this. Warmth, melting, blue sky with wisps of high cloud. Henry felt something stir in his chest. Relief, yes, but also something else. Something that felt like vindication. He'd told the township at the last school board meeting that the cold snap would break soon. He'd staked his reputation on it. A man didn't survive 9 Dakota winters without learning to read the signs. Martha came up behind him, silent in her nightdress. She looked over his shoulder at the thermometer. "Too warm," she said quietly. "Feels wrong." Henry shook his head. "Winter broke early. We should be grateful." "Henry," her voice carried a note of warning he recognized but chose to ignore. "When it warms like this after cold like that—" "Old country superstition," he said, cutting her off gently but firmly. "We're in America now, Martha. Weather follows patterns. This is a warm front, nothing more." She said nothing else, but he felt her doubt like a physical presence in the room. At 7:30, Henry hitched the wagon to bring Emma Hayes to school. The girl had been boarding with them during the school week since her father died of typhoid 8 months prior. Her mother, Bridget, lived 3 miles away in Milford, sewing dresses for American women who paid in cash. Emma stayed with the Garretts Monday through Friday, helped Martha with chores, studied her lessons, and mostly kept to herself. She was waiting by the wagon when Henry came out, her school reader clutched to her chest, her dinner pail in hand. But she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the sky, looking east where the sun had just cleared the horizon. Looking at something Henry could see from where he stood, but hadn't paid attention to until that moment. 2 bright spots flanked the rising sun. They shimmered with iridescent light, impossibly vivid against the pale January blue. Colors rippled through them, red and orange at their inner edges, fading to white at their outer curves. They hung in the air like eyes watching the world below. Sundogs. Parhelia, the scientific term, though Henry had never bothered learning it. Mock suns, some called them. Ice crystals in the upper atmosphere refracting light. A purely optical phenomenon with no predictive value whatsoever. That's what Henry told himself as he climbed onto the wagon seat. "Mr. Garrett?" Emma's voice was quiet but urgent. "I saw sundogs this morning." Henry looked at her, really looked at her for the first time that morning. Emma Hayes was 11 years old, small for her age, with her grandmother's Norwegian features and her grandmother's Norwegian eyes. Those eyes held something Henry didn't want to acknowledge. Knowledge. Certainty. The kind of certainty that came from voices beyond the grave. "I see them too," Henry said carefully. "Ice crystals. Nothing more. My grandmother called them soul-hund sunwolves." Emma's fingers tightened on her book. She said when the wolves chase the sun, the killing cold follows 3 hours behind. Henry felt irritation flare in his chest. Not at Emma, at Margaret Hayes, dead 2 winters, now still spreading her old country nonsense through her granddaughter's voice. The woman had filled the girl's head with every superstition and folk tale from Norway. Sunwolves, sky omens, signs and portents that had no place in modern farming. "Your grandmother's stories won't feed cattle or build barns, girl," Henry said. His voice came out harder than he'd intended. "Get in the wagon." Emma climbed up beside him, but she didn't stop looking at the sky. Didn't stop looking at those 2 bright spots chasing the sun across the eastern horizon. They rode in silence for the first mile. Henry kept his attention on the road, on the horses, on anything except the tightness growing in his chest. The tightness that felt like doubt trying to take root. He'd seen sundogs before. Everyone had. They appeared maybe 3 or 4 times every winter when conditions were right. Cold air ice crystals, the angle of the sun. Pure physics. They meant nothing. Except Henry had seen them twice in his 9 winters here. And both times within hours the weather had turned violent. No. Coincidence. Pattern-seeking and random noise. The kind of thinking that kept humanity in caves for millennia while superstition ruled the world. "Mr. Garrett," Emma's voice cut through his thoughts, "we should keep the children inside today. All day. No one should go home until we're certain." Certain of what? Henry heard the edge in his own voice. That the weather might change. Weather always changes, Emma. That's what weather does. My grandmother survived the great storm of 1823 in Bergen. Emma spoke like she was reciting a lesson, which she probably was, reciting Margaret Hayes' voice from beyond the grave. She said the sunwolves came that morning too. By afternoon, the storm had buried 3 villages. 57 people died. She lived because her grandmother put her in an iron barrel and sealed it against the wind. Henry's hands tightened on the reins. An iron barrel, the kind of detail that made a story feel real even when it was probably half myth and half embellishment. Margaret Hayes had been a storyteller, a keeper of old knowledge. The kind of woman who remembered which plants healed and which killed, who could predict weather by watching birds and clouds and the way smoke rose from chimneys. The kind of woman Henry both respected and distrusted in equal measure. Because that kind of knowledge came from a world that didn't exist anymore. A world where people died because they didn't understand meteorology or medicine or basic science. Henry had come to America to escape that world. He'd built his farm on American principles. Observation, experience, rational thought, not grandmother's tales and sunwolves. "Emma," he said carefully, "your grandmother was a wise woman in many ways. But this is Dakota, not Norway. Different land, different weather. My bones tell me this warm front is exactly what it looks like. A break in the cold, maybe an early spring." "Your bones." Emma's voice was so quiet he almost didn't hear it. "Yes, my bones. I've lived through 9 winters here, girl, 9. I lost 2 fingers to frostbite in the winter of '81. I've seen 3 killer blizzards. I know what they feel like coming. This," he gestured at the warm air, the melting snow, the blue sky. "This is not a blizzard morning." Emma said nothing else. But Henry felt her disagreement like a weight on his shoulders. They reached Pleasant Valley Schoolhouse at 8 o'clock. 17 children were already there, clustered around the front steps in the warm morning air. No coats, no mittens. Some of the boys had their sleeves rolled up like it was April instead of January. Miss Clara Ashford stood on the porch, 23 years old and fresh from Illinois. She'd been teaching for exactly 3 months. She smiled when she saw the wagon relief brightening her features. "Mr. Garrett, Emma, isn't it a glorious morning? I was just telling the children we might open the windows later if it stays this warm." Henry helped Emma down from the wagon. He saw her look at the other children, saw her take in their lack of preparation, saw something like fear cross her face. "Miss Ashford," Emma said, her voice carrying across the yard, "there's going to be a storm. We need to keep everyone inside today." The children turned to look at her. Some laughed. Peter Morgan, 14 years old and nearly a man, snorted with derision. "What storm, Hayes? Look at the sky. You've been drinking your grandmother's witch brew." Several children giggled. Emma's face flushed, but she didn't back down. "I saw sundogs this morning. My grandmother taught me what they mean. When the wolves chase the sun, the killing cold follows." "Sun wolves." Peter made his voice high and mocking. "Better watch out, everyone. The wolves are coming." More laughter. Miss Ashford looked uncertain, glancing between Emma and the clear blue sky. "Emma, dear, I appreciate your concern, but Mr. Garrett is on the school board, and I'm sure he would have said something if there was real danger." All eyes turned to Henry. This was the moment, the fulcrum point, the 30 seconds that would define the next 30 years. Henry stood there in the warm morning air and felt the weight of every gaze on him. 17 children, one young teacher. Emma Hayes, with her grandmother's certainty burning in her eyes, and in his mind a cascade of thoughts that came too fast to fully process but slow enough to remember forever. If he believed Emma, if he sided with an 11-year-old girl's interpretation of an optical phenomenon over his own 9 years of experience, what would that mean? The school board would hear about it. The township would hear about it. Henry Garrett, who had survived 9 winters, who sat on the school board, who was supposed to know better, had been swayed by a child's superstition. His authority would evaporate. His reputation would suffer. Men would question his judgment on other matters. The carefully built respect he'd earned over 9 hard years would crack like ice in spring. And for what? For sundogs. For an old woman's tales told to a grieving granddaughter. Henry looked at the sky one more time. Still blue, still clear, still warm. 99% certain this was just a warm front, just a break in the cold, just weather being weather. 1% doubt whispered by an 11-year-old girl who believed in sunwolves. Henry made his choice. "Emma," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority, "come with me." He walked toward the schoolhouse door, and Emma followed, confusion on her face. The other children parted to let them through. Inside the schoolhouse was a single room with a cast-iron stove, rows of benches, and a teacher's desk. The walls were thin plank, the floor bare wood. It would hold heat as long as they kept the fire going, but it wouldn't hold against what Henry wasn't admitting might be coming. He turned to face Emma in front of all the children who had followed them inside, curious now. "Emma, you're frightening the younger ones with your talk." His voice was firm, measured, the voice of a man who knew what he was doing. "Little Sarah Lindgren cried herself to sleep last night because you told her about people freezing in their beds." Sarah, 6 years old, stood near the front. Her eyes were red-rimmed. Emma looked at her, stricken. "I was just trying to warn her," Emma said quietly. "Warning becomes panic when it's based on superstition instead of fact." Henry kept his tone even, reasonable. "I've survived 9 Dakota winters, Emma, 9. Miss Ashford here has survived 3 months, but she's learning. You've survived less than 1 full winter, and you're trying to tell everyone that you know better than men with real experience." He saw Emma's face crumble slightly, saw her recognize that she was losing this argument before it even began. "The sundogs," she tried again. "My grandmother said—" "Your grandmother is dead, Emma." The words came out harsher than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Couldn't take them back without showing weakness. Her old country knowledge died with her. This is America. This is Dakota. And in Dakota, we rely on observation and experience, not stories about wolves chasing the sun. Silence filled the schoolhouse. Even the children who'd been laughing before had gone quiet. Henry pressed his advantage. "I'm sending you to my farm. Martha will find you work to do until you learn that spreading fear gets children killed." The irony of that statement would haunt him for 3 decades. Emma's face went white. "Mr. Garrett, please, just keep them inside. Just for today. Please. Walk to the farm, Emma. It's only a mile and a half. The exercise will give you time to think about the difference between wisdom and foolishness." "My coat." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "It's inside on the peg." Henry looked at the coat hanging just 10 feet away, looked at Emma's thin cotton dress, looked at the warm sunshine pouring through the windows, and made a decision that would define him. "If the cold is broken like I said, you won't need it. The walk will teach you humility." He said it to make a point, to show Emma and all the children that he was right about the weather, to demonstrate that her fear was baseless. He said it, and in saying it, he sealed fates he couldn't imagine. Emma looked at him one last time. Her eyes held something he would spend 30 years trying to forget. Not anger, not fear, just a terrible, resigned understanding. She turned and walked out of the schoolhouse in her cotton dress and thin wool stockings, carrying only her school reader and her dinner pail. Henry watched her go, watched her small figure move down the road toward his farm, and then he turned back to Miss Ashford. "Dismiss the children early today," he said. "Say around 10:30. Send them home while the weather's still mild. No point keeping them cooped up on such a beautiful day." Miss Ashford nodded, clearly relieved to have clear direction. Henry left the schoolhouse, climbed back onto his wagon, and drove home. He didn't look back at Emma, didn't watch to see if she made it safely down the road. He was 99% certain she would. That 1% of doubt he buried deep. Henry reached his farm at 9 o'clock. Martha met him at the door, her face tight with concern. "Where's Emma?" "Send her home. She was scaring the children with her grandmother's superstitions." Martha's expression hardened. "What superstitions?" "Sundogs mean a blizzard is coming, the wolves chasing the sun. That nonsense Margaret filled her head with." Martha turned to the window, looked out at the bright morning. Then she turned back to Henry, and her voice carried an edge he rarely heard. "The girl lost her father 8 months ago, Henry. Her grandmother was all she had left of the old knowledge, the old safety. And you sent her away for trying to keep children safe. I sent her away for spreading panic based on nothing but old country tales." "Where's her coat?" The question hit him like a fist to the gut. "At the schoolhouse. You sent an 11-year-old girl to walk a mile and a half in January without a coat. It's 40 degrees out, Martha. Right now it's 40 degrees. What about an hour from now?" Henry felt anger rise in his chest, anger at Martha for questioning him, anger at Emma for putting him in this position, anger at himself for the doubt that kept trying to surface. "I made a decision," he said firmly. "A man doesn't second-guess himself." Martha looked at him for a long moment. Then she said something that would echo in his memory forever. "No, Henry, a man doesn't second-guess himself in front of others. In front of his wife in private, he should be honest enough to admit when he might be wrong." "I'm not wrong." "Your bones telling you that." "Yes, my bones tell me winter broke early." Martha turned back to the window. "Then I hope your bones are better at reading weather than reading hearts." Henry left the kitchen, went out to check on the livestock. The cattle seemed restless, shifting and lowing in ways that made him uneasy. The horses kept looking northwest, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. Animals knew things men didn't. Old country wisdom said so. But old country wisdom also said sundogs meant death was coming. And Henry Garrett was a modern man who relied on experience, not folklore. At 10 o'clock, the temperature was 35 degrees. At 10:15, 32. At 10:30, 28, and dropping fast. Henry stood in his barn and watched his breath start to fog. Watched the horses get more agitated. Watched the cattle bunch together, instincts older than humanity, telling them to prepare for something their bodies recognized even if their minds couldn't name it. He looked northwest. The horizon was changing. Not clouds exactly. Something thicker, heavier. A smudge of gray-black that seemed to eat the light as it approached. Martha appeared in the barn doorway. "Henry, you need to go get those children. They're safe in the schoolhouse. Emma's not. She's out there, walking to our farm, in a cotton dress." The tightness in Henry's chest became a vice. "She's young, strong, a mile and a half. She'll be here any minute." Will she? Henry wanted to say yes, wanted to believe it, wanted his 99% certainty to overcome that 1% of doubt. But the doubt was growing, spreading, becoming something he couldn't ignore. The children at school are safe, he said, convincing himself as much as Martha. Miss Ashford will keep them warm. They have the stove. They have wood. They'll be fine. And the 14 she sent home at 10:30 like you told her to. Henry's blood went cold. What? I saw them walking past our farm 20 minutes ago, heading to their homes, because you told Miss Ashford to dismiss them early. The vice became a crushing weight. At 11:11 in the morning, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 15 minutes. Henry stood at his window and watched the world end. The wall he'd seen on the northwestern horizon hit the farm like the hand of God. One moment there was gray light and rising wind. The next there was only white chaos and a roar like a locomotive bearing down at full speed. The farmhouse shook. The windows rattled. Snow drove horizontally across the yard with such force that Henry couldn't see the barn 50 feet away, couldn't see the fence, couldn't see anything beyond the glass except swirling white madness. The temperature plunged from 30 degrees above zero to 6 degrees below in the time it took to draw 3 breaths. Martha stood beside him, her hand over her mouth. She's out there, Martha whispered. That little girl is out there because of you. Henry said nothing. There was nothing to say. Emma Hayes was somewhere in that white hell, somewhere between the schoolhouse and the farm, without a coat, without shelter, without any protection except her own wits and whatever her dead grandmother's voice could tell her. 17 children had been at the schoolhouse when he left. 3 had stayed with Miss Ashford. 14 had walked out into the warming morning, heading for homes that were 1 mile, 2 miles, 3 miles away. Into the white, into the killing cold. Because Henry Garrett had told Miss Ashford the cold had broken. He stood at the window for 7 hours. He couldn't go out. Visibility was 0. The wind was strong enough to knock a man down. The cold would kill in minutes. Going out would just add his corpse to whatever count they'd make when this was over. So he stood, and he waited, and he counted. Counted the children he'd sent home. Counted the ones he knew were tough, the ones who were fragile. Counted the miles between schoolhouse and farmsteads. Counted the minutes a child could survive at 30 below, with wind that cut like knives. Counted his certainty against Emma Hayes' warning. Counted the cost of pride. Martha didn't speak to him. She sat in her chair and wept silently, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed. Praying, probably. Henry hadn't prayed in 20 years, hadn't seen the point when observation and reason could explain the world. But at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, with the storm still screaming and the cold still killing, Henry Garrett got down on his knees on the floor of his farmhouse. He didn't pray for himself, didn't pray for forgiveness. He prayed for the children, prayed for Emma Hayes, who had tried to save them, prayed for Peter Morgan and Sarah Lindgren and all the others whose names he couldn't stop recounting in his mind. Prayed that his pride hadn't murdered them all. But even as he prayed, he knew God didn't work that way. He knew that if Emma was dead, if the children were dead, it was because of him. Because he couldn't admit that an 11-year-old girl might know something he didn't. Because he chose certainty over safety. Because he chose his reputation over their lives. The storm screamed on. The hours crawled past. And Henry Garrett knelt on his farmhouse floor and learned what it felt like to kill with words instead of weapons. Outside in the ravine, a quarter mile from the schoolhouse, Emma Hayes was sealing herself into an iron boiler with grass and mud and pages torn from her school reader. Outside, William Clark was carrying his little sister Annie through the white, looking for anything that might save them. Outside, Peter Morgan was walking in circles, unable to see the schoolhouse 200 yards away until he couldn't walk anymore. Outside, Miss Clara Ashford was digging into a haystack with her bare hands trying to hollow out space for 3 terrified children. Outside, the wolves that chased the sun were devouring everything in their path. And inside, Henry Garrett finally understood the difference between knowing and wisdom. Too late. 30 seconds of certainty. 30 years of consequence. The price of pride written in children's graves. The cold that came after 11/11 was not the cold of winter. It was the cold of something older. Something that existed before humans learned to make fire or build walls or tell themselves they were safe. Emma Hayes felt it the moment the wall hit. She had been walking for 45 minutes when the temperature started falling. She'd made it perhaps 3/4 of a mile from the schoolhouse, maybe halfway to the Garrett farm. The road stretched before her hard-packed snow and frozen earth bordered by fence posts that marked the way like grave markers. When the first gust of wind struck her, it felt like being slapped by a giant hand made of ice. She stopped walking, turned to look back at the schoolhouse. It was still visible, a dark square against the brightening gray, but already it looked farther away than it should have. Distance did strange things in this landscape, played tricks on the eye. Emma looked north toward the Garrett farm. Nothing but empty prairie and that growing wall of darkness eating the sky. She was 11 years old. She had walked this road dozens of times. She knew every fence post, every slight rise, every place where the land dipped down into shallow coulees. In normal weather, she could walk to the farm blindfolded. But this was not normal weather. This was what her grandmother had warned about, what the sun wolves had promised. Emma did the arithmetic in her head. Distance to schoolhouse, behind her quarter-mile, maybe more now. Distance to Garrett farm ahead, 3/4 of a mile at least. The wall on the horizon was moving faster than a horse could gallop. She'd seen storms move before. This one was different. This one was hunting. She couldn't reach either building. The certainty settled over her like a shroud. She was going to die out here unless she found shelter where she stood. That's when she remembered the ravine. Her grandmother's voice came to her clear, as if the old woman stood beside her. Iron holds heat like stone, holds memory. When the wolves come, hide in something that remembers. The abandoned threshing operation. The machinery they'd left 3 years ago when the venture went bankrupt. Too heavy to move, too worthless to claim. She'd walked past it dozens of times, barely noticing the rust-red shapes half buried in the shallow ravine a quarter-mile east of the road. One of those shapes was a boiler. Emma didn't think. Thinking took time, and time was the one thing the wall wouldn't give her. She ran. The ravine was steeper than she remembered. She half climbed, half fell down the slope, her school reader pressed to her chest, her dinner pail banging against her leg. The wind was already changing, shifting from southwest to northwest, bringing with it a taste of something so cold it burned her lungs. The boiler lay at the bottom like the corpse of some great iron beast. 14 feet long, maybe more, its cylindrical body frost-rimmed and half-buried in dead grass. It was a locomotive boiler, the kind they used to power the threshing machines, all rivets and rust and darkness. Emma had looked at it before the way children look at abandoned things, curious but cautious. It had always seemed dead, empty. Just another piece of junk the prairie was slowly reclaiming. Now it looked like salvation. The firebox door hung open on corroded hinges, a dark rectangle perhaps 2 feet across, just large enough for an 11-year-old girl if she squeezed. Emma crawled inside. The darkness swallowed her whole. The interior smelled of rust and old ash and something chemical residue from years of burning coal. The floor of the firebox was coated with soot that blackened her hands and dress. She could see almost nothing. Only faint light from the open door and a few gaps where pipes had been removed. But she was out of the wind. She pressed her palm against the iron wall. Cold, terribly cold, but solid. The wind couldn't reach her here. The snow that was about to drive across the prairie at 60 miles an hour couldn't touch her inside this shell. If she could seal it. Her grandmother's voice again. A house with gaps is a house for ghosts. Emma crawled back to the door opening and looked out. The sky had gone gray. The wall was perhaps 2 miles away now, close enough to see it clearly. Not clouds, but something denser. A roiling mass of darkness shot through with white. Snow moving horizontally at speeds that would strip flesh from bone. She had maybe 15 minutes, maybe less. Emma tore at the prairie grass on the ravine slopes, ripping it from the frozen ground until her fingers bled. Dead grass, dry and brittle, but it was something. She chipped at the frozen earth with a rock, gathering lumps of half-frozen clay. She tore her apron from her waist-thin cotton, but something to stuff into gaps. And then she opened her school reader. McGuffey's Fourth Eclectic Reader. The book her father had bought her the year before he died. His last gift to her. Each page a memory of his voice reading to her by lamplight. She hesitated only a moment. Then she started tearing pages out. Back inside the boiler, Emma worked by feel more than sight. The firebox door wouldn't close completely. The hinges had warped, leaving a gap of 2 or 3 inches along one side. She packed grass into the gap, pressing it tight with her bleeding fingers. She smeared mud over the grass, sealing it. She worked methodically the way her grandmother had taught her to seal windows against winter wind. Every gap was a pathway for death. The ashpan dampers at the bottom were rusted open. She stuffed them with mud and grass until nothing moved through them. The gauge pipe holes where instruments had been removed, circular openings 1 to 3 inches across, she plugged with whatever she had. Her apron went into the largest. Pages from her reader crumpled and twisted went into the smaller ones. The smoke box at the far end required crawling 14 feet through absolute darkness, the iron pressing close on all sides, the space so tight she could barely move. Her hands found the circular door hanging loose, rattling in the rising wind. She couldn't seal it completely, but she packed grass around the edges, pressed mudwood into every gap she could reach, wedged her dinner pail against the door to hold it closed. One opening left. Her father's voice, now a memory from 3 years ago, when they'd prepared the root cellar for winter. "You can suffocate in a sealed room, Emma. Air needs to move or you'll breathe yourself to death." She left a gap near the firebox door. Small, perhaps 2 square inches, enough for air to seep in, not enough for the wind to follow. The light through the gap was gray now, darkening fast. Emma's hands were numb. Her fingers had no feeling. Her feet were going numb inside her thin stockings. She curled into the tightest ball she could manage, knees drawn to chest, arms wrapped around her legs, face buried against her thighs. Made herself as small as possible. Tried to stop shivering, but her body wouldn't obey. Iron holds heat, but there was no heat to hold. Not yet. Her body produced heat, she knew that much. But her body was cooling faster than it could warm the iron around her. The boiler was draining her, pulling the life out degree by degree. She began to pray in Norwegian words her grandmother had taught her. Fader vår du samar i himlen, our Father who art in heaven. Then the storm hit. She didn't hear it coming. One moment there was gray light and rising wind. The next there was only blackness and a roar like the end of the world. The entire boiler shook. Snow, fine as flour and sharp as ground glass, drove through the 2-inch gap in a horizontal jet. Emma pressed her face into the crumpled pages of her school reader, protecting her eyes, feeling the ice particles sting every bit of exposed skin. The temperature plunged. She could feel it falling degree by degree, the cold seeping through the iron walls, through her cotton dress, through her skin. The boiler that had seemed merely cold now felt like a coffin of ice. Time stopped meaning anything. She didn't know if she'd been inside for minutes or hours. The roar was constant, unchanging, filling the world and leaving no space for thought. The darkness was absolute. Her body shivered violently, uncontrollably. Her muscles burned with the effort of trying to generate heat. Her core temperature was dropping. She knew this from watching animals die in the cold. First the shivering, desperate and involuntary. Then the shivering would slow, then stop, then sleep, then death. But something was changing. Slowly, impossibly slowly, the air around her was warming. Not warm, nothing approaching warm, but less deadly, less immediately fatal. Her body produced 300 British thermal units per hour. In a space of 40 cubic feet with 3 tons of iron to absorb and reflect that heat, the temperature was stabilizing. Not rising above freezing, but rising above the killing cold outside. The iron was remembering. Emma's shivering slowed, not because she was dying, but because the terrible urgency was passing. She was still cold, brutally cold, but her fingers had regained enough sensation to ache. Her breath still plumed white, but it didn't cut her to hungs. She was not comfortable. She was not warm, but she was alive. Outside the storm raged on, the wind had not diminished. The roar continued constant and terrible. But inside her iron shell, Emma Hayes had created a pocket of survival. She held her school reader, or what was left of it, against her chest. And she waited. The knocking came sometime in the afternoon. Emma had lost all sense of time. The darkness inside the boiler was complete. The roar of the storm was unchanging. She might have been in there for 2 hours or 10. Her body had gone past cold into a kind of numb acceptance. At first she thought the sound was debris, something torn loose by the wind and hurled against the boiler. A fence post maybe, a branch from some distant tree. But the sound was rhythmic, metallic, deliberate. Then voices, muffled by iron and wind and the roar of the storm, but unmistakably human. Children's voices screaming. Emma crawled to the firebox door. Her hands found the seals she'd made, grass and mud, and torn pages still holding. She hesitated. If she opened the door, the killing wind would come in. The warmth she'd built would vanish in seconds. The temperature would plunge. She might die. But someone was out there. Children were out there in the storm, in the dark, in the cold that killed in minutes. Her grandmother's voice one last time. The greatest sin is not dying when you could have lived. It's living when you could have saved someone else. Emma tore away the seals. The wind hit her like a fist. Snow drove into the boiler, into her face, into her lungs. The temperature dropped instantly, brutally. She could see nothing, only swirling white chaos, formless and infinite. But she could hear voices closer now, desperate. Help, help us, please. A shape materialized in the white. A boy, maybe 12, carrying something in his arms. A smaller figure stumbled beside him, clinging to his coat. They were 3 feet from the boiler opening. They couldn't see it. Emma screamed. Right over here, the boy's head turned. He saw the dark rectangle of the firebox door. He lunged toward it, desperate and blind. Then they were inside. 3 bodies tumbling through the opening, collapsing on the soot-covered floor, gasping and crying and shaking. Emma knew them immediately. William Clark, 12 years old, son of Rachel Clark, who had said good riddance to the Hayes girl. Kate Clark, 9 years old, William's sister. And in William's arms, limp and gray-faced 7-year-old Annie Clark. The children Emma's warning had tried to save. The children Henry Garrett had sent home because the cold had broken. Help me seal the door, Emma said. Her voice cut through William's, crying through Kate's terrified whimpering. Her voice carried something that made a 12-year-old boy who was trying very hard to be a man stop and listen. William looked at her, his face streaked with snot and tears and ice. If we don't close it, we all die, Emma said. William moved. Together they wrestled the firebox door as close to shut as the warped hinges would allow. Emma grabbed what was left of her grass, her mud, her torn pages. William helped his frozen hands, fumbling, but trying. Kate curled in a ball, shaking so violently her teeth chattered audibly. Annie didn't move. Slowly, inch by inch, they sealed the opening. The roar dimmed. The snow stopped driving in. The darkness became merely dark again, not the violent, swirling chaos of the open storm. Emma looked at Annie. The 7-year-old was pale. Not just cold pale, but gray, the color of something that had started to die. Her lips were blue. Her eyes were closed. Her chest moved barely. Emma had seen this before. Her grandmother had treated it in Norway. Hypothermia. The body shutting down to protect the core, sacrificing the extremities, rationing whatever heat remained for the heart and brain. Take off her coat, Emma said. William stared at her. She's freezing. The coat is soaked. It's making her colder. Emma's voice carried her grandmother's authority now. Take it off. Put her between you and Kate. Hold her against your bodies. Breathe on her face. Talk to her. William's hands shook as he stripped Annie's wet coat. The little girl moaned but didn't wake. William positioned himself on one side, Kate on the other, Annie sandwiched between them. Emma curled at Annie's feet, pressing them against her stomach beneath her dress. The cold of Annie's skin was shocking, like touching ice. Emma's body recoiled, but she held on. 4 children in a boiler meant for one. 4 bodies producing 1,200 British thermal units per hour. The space was crowded, uncomfortable, the air thick with their breath. But the temperature was stabilizing again, rising. The iron walls absorbed their combined heat, reflected it back, created a survival loop that had kept Emma alive and would now keep all 4 of them breathing. Annie's feet were like stones against Emma's belly. Emma held them anyway. Outside the boiler, the world was ending in different ways. At Pleasant Valley Schoolhouse, Miss Clara Ashford fought for her life and the lives of 3 children. The storm had hit at 11:11, and by 11:30, the fire in the cast-iron stove had consumed the last of the wood. She'd rationed it carefully, knowing 4 hours was all they had. But 4 hours wasn't enough. The temperature inside the schoolhouse dropped toward freezing. Ice formed on the inside of the windows, a phenomenon Miss Ashford had read about but never witnessed. The cold came through every crack in the walls, under the door, through the keyhole. It was patient and relentless and absolutely merciless. Sarah Lindgren, 6 years old, cried in the corner. Thomas, 9, tried to be brave. Mary 11 held her little sister and wondered if her family would ever know what happened to them. At 2 o'clock, Miss Ashford made a decision. She remembered a haystack 200 yards south of the schoolhouse. She'd seen it that morning, a dark mound against the white snow. If they could reach it, they could burrow inside, use the frozen grass for insulation. She roped the three children together, Sarah to Thomas, to Mary to herself, a line of four, each one tied at the waist with rope from the school supply closet. Then she opened the door and led them into the white. They found the haystack by pure luck. Miss Ashford had tried to walk south, but in the white there was no south, no north, no direction at all. They stumbled into the haystack when they had already lost all sense of where the schoolhouse was. Miss Ashford dug into the hay with her bare hands. The frozen grass cut her palms. Her fingers went numb, then black frostbite claiming them even as she worked. But she hollowed out a space large enough for four, and they crawled inside. Buried in frozen grass, pressed together, breathing each other's air, they waited for the storm to pass. Thomas and Mary would survive, but they would never forget the night their little sister stopped breathing in Miss Ashford's arms. 200 yards away, Peter Morgan was dying. He'd left the schoolhouse at 10:30, confident and strong. 14 years old, nearly a man, he'd walked the road to his family's farm 100 times. He knew every turn, every landmark. A mile and a half was nothing. When the storm hit, Peter kept walking. He was strong. He could handle cold. He'd survived Dakota winters before. But this cold was different. This cold didn't care about strength or youth or confidence. Peter walked in circles, unable to see more than 2 feet ahead. He called out for help, but the wind tore his voice away. He tried to retrace his steps, but in the white there were no steps to retrace. His body temperature dropped. His thinking slowed. Hypothermia is a kind thief. It steals consciousness, gently making the victim believe they're just tired, just need to rest for a moment. Peter lay down in the snow, 200 yards from the schoolhouse. His hand reached toward where he thought the building should be. He never saw it. He never knew how close he was to safety. He just stopped being cold, stopped being anything, and the snow covered him like a blanket. At the Garrett farm, Henry stood at his window and counted ghosts. Peter Morgan. That was one. He told the boy to walk home, told him the weather was fine, told him there was nothing to fear. Peter had trusted him. The Anderson children, 3 of them heading to a farm half a mile from the school. Henry had watched them walk past his property at 10:45 laughing because the warm weather meant they could play outside. Were they dead now? Were they huddled somewhere freezing? Or had they made it home? He didn't know, couldn't know, could only stand and watch the white chaos and count the children he might have killed. Emma Hayes. That was the worst one. The one that made his chest feel like it was being crushed. He'd sent her walking without a coat. Sent her into this because she'd told the truth and he'd called it foolishness. If she was dead, it was murder. Not legally, maybe, but morally, absolutely. Henry had killed with pride instead of weapons, with certainty instead of bullets, with 3 decades of thought compressed into 30 seconds of choice. Martha sat in her chair and didn't look at him, didn't speak. Just sat with her hands folded and her eyes closed, praying to a God that Henry had stopped believing in because he thought observation and reason were enough. He understood now, kneeling on his farmhouse floor for the second time in 20 years, that observation and reason were never enough. Because a man could observe the sky and reason about weather patterns and still be completely catastrophically wrong. Emma Hayes had observed sundogs and reasoned based on her grandmother's wisdom. She'd been right. Henry had observed a warm morning and reasoned based on his own experience. He'd been wrong, and children were dying because of the difference. The storm screamed on. The hours crawled past. And Henry Garrett finally understood that experience without wisdom was just arrogance wearing a respectable coat. In the boiler, Annie stirred. It was small, a twitch of her foot against Emma's stomach, but Emma felt it like a lightning strike. She pressed her hands tighter around the girl's ankles. Annie Kate's voice ragged with cold and fear. "Annie, can you hear me?" A moan low and barely audible over the muffled roar of the wind outside, but unmistakably alive. "She's waking up," William said. His voice cracked with something between hope and terror. "Keep holding her," Emma said. "Keep breathing on her face." "Don't stop talking to her," Kate began to sing, a Norwegian lullaby Bisson. Lull, the same one Emma's grandmother had sung. The familiar melody floated through the darkness, thin and trembling, but steady. William joined in his voice, deeper, rougher, harmonizing badly but trying. Emma held Annie's feet and listened and tried not to think about the storm outside, about Peter Morgan walking in circles, about Miss Ashford digging into frozen hay with bleeding hands, about Henry Garrett standing at his window, counting the cost of certainty. She thought instead about iron remembering heat, about four bodies keeping each other alive, about her grandmother's voice telling her that the greatest wisdom was knowing when to trust voices from the past instead of men who claimed to know the future. The storm raged on, but inside the iron shell, four children breathed and sang and held each other and survived. The wind died at dawn. Emma didn't realize it at first. The roar had been so constant, so all-encompassing for 18 hours that its absence felt like a physical shock. The silence pressed against her ears made them ring with phantom noise. She lifted her head from her knees and listened. Nothing. No screaming wind, no rattling iron, no driving snow finding every microscopic gap in her seals. Just stillness, vast and absolute, and somewhere beyond the boiler walls the faint creak of settling ice. "Is it over?" Kate whispered in the darkness. Emma crawled toward the firebox door, her joints stiff, her muscles aching from 18 hours of cramped stillness. Her fingers found the seal's mud and grass, half frozen, still holding. She pulled at them slowly, carefully, not knowing what she would find on the other side. The first light in 18 hours stabbed into her eyes like needles. She squinted, blinked, and saw white. White everywhere. Snow drifted against the boiler piled 3 feet high on the windward side. The sky above was pale blue, cloudless, innocent, as if the storm had never happened. The air was utterly still and cold. So cold that her first breath burned her lungs like inhaling fire. Emma pushed through the snow, widening the opening, and crawled out into the ravine. Her legs barely held her. 18 hours curled in a ball had turned her muscles to wood. But she stood swaying and looked at the world the storm had left behind. The prairie stretched before her, flat and featureless, a blank white page. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. No birds, no wind, just silence so complete it felt like the world had died. In the distance, she could see dark shapes against the snow. Cattle frozen where the storm had caught them, standing upright like statues. Closer, something that might have been a horse. And there, barely visible, the dark outline of the Pleasant Valley schoolhouse, a mile away across the white. The sun hung low on the eastern horizon, pale and cold, without a hint of the sundogs that had warned her. Behind her, William was trying to help Annie out of the boiler. The 7-year-old whimpered with pain. Her feet were badly frostbitten, blackened at the toes. She couldn't put weight on them. William himself could barely stand. His fingers were dark, the tips gone black where frostbite had claimed them. His face was raw from wind-driven ice red and blistered like he'd been burned. Kate shook with violent tremors that wouldn't stop her teeth chattering so hard Emma worried they'd crack. Emma looked north toward the Garrett farm. 1.5 miles across frozen prairie with 3 injured children and a temperature that had to be 30 below. They couldn't make it alone. "We wait," Emma said. Her voice sounded strange after 18 hours of silence, broken only by whispered prayers and lullabies. "Someone will come looking." "What if they don't?" William's voice cracked. He was trying so hard to be brave, to be the man his mother expected, but the fear leaked through every word. "They will," Emma said, trying to sound more certain than she felt. "When the storm breaks, people start searching. Someone will come." She helped them back into the boiler. Warmth was warmth even now. They huddled together in the darkness, listening to the silence, waiting. Henry Garrett had not slept. He'd stood at his window through the night, watching the white chaos, counting hours and children and sins. When the wind finally died at dawn, he was already dressed in his heaviest coat, his warmest mittens, his fur-lined boots. He kissed Martha. She was crying, though she tried to hide it. "I'll bring her back," he said, though he didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it. Emma Hayes had been out in that storm for 18 hours. No one survived 18 hours in a Dakota blizzard without shelter. But he had to look, had to find her body at least, had to bring her home to her mother and say, "I did this. I killed your daughter with my pride." He walked out into the frozen silence. The world had been transformed. Snow lay in drifts 8 feet high in places, sculpted by the wind into frozen waves. Fence posts were buried. Roads had vanished. The landscape had been erased and rewritten in white. Henry found Peter Morgan first, 200 yards from the schoolhouse, face down in the snow, one hand reaching toward the building he'd never seen. Henry knelt beside the boy, brushed the ice from his face with his 8 remaining fingers, and said a prayer in Norwegian for the first time since he'd buried his own father. "I killed you, boy," Henry whispered. "With my certainty." He left Peter where he lay. There would be time to bring the bodies in later. Right now, he had to keep searching. He found the haystack where Miss Ashford and the Lindgren children had sheltered. The young teacher was alive, barely half delirious with frostbite and exposure. Her hands were black fingers gone rigid. She clutched 2 children with arms that wouldn't bend. Thomas Lindgren, 9 alive. Mary Lindgren, 11 alive. Sarah Lindgren, 6 dead. The little girl who had cried when Emma tried to warn her. The one Emma had frightened with talk of people freezing in their beds. She'd frozen anyway, but in a haystack instead, held by a teacher who tried desperately to save her. Henry helped get them to a neighboring farmhouse, called for a doctor from Milford. Miss Ashford kept saying the same thing over and over through chattering teeth. "I should have listened. I should have kept them inside." Emma tried to tell us. Henry said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound like excuse or deflection. He mounted his horse and continued searching. By mid-morning, Henry had gathered a search party, 4 men on horseback, spreading across the prairie in a widening pattern. They found bodies. They found survivors. They found the particular horror of the children's blizzard. Mittens lying in the snow where small hands had dropped them. School readers scattered along paths that led nowhere. A bonnet frozen to a fence post. The Anderson children, three of them huddled in a snowdrift half a mile from their farm. 2 alive, 1 dead. Tommy Sorensen in his family's barn curled among the pigs for warmth. Alive. And so many questions without answers. Where were the Clark children? Where was Emma Hayes? Henry rode past the ravine with the abandoned threshing equipment at 10 o'clock. He'd ridden past it 100 times in 9 years, barely noticed it. Just another scar on the landscape, rusted metal, slowly being reclaimed by the prairie. But this time he saw movement, a small figure climbing up the slope of the ravine, turning to face him with a frost-burned face, frost-blackened, fingers and eyes that held neither fear nor surprise. Emma Hayes. Henry dismounted. He could not speak, could not process what he was seeing. The girl he'd sent to die standing before him, alive. Behind her, 3 other figures emerged from something in the ravine. A cylindrical iron shape he'd seen before but never really looked at. William Clark, Kate Clark, and in William's arms, pale but breathing Annie Clark. 4 children, alive. "The sundogs," Henry said. His voice came out strangled. "You saw them." Emma nodded. "You warned us." Emma nodded again. "And I sent you to die because I couldn't admit an 11-year-old knew more than me." Emma looked at him for a long moment. Her face was impossible to read. Exhaustion, yes. Pain, certainly. But something else. Something that looked almost like pity. "You didn't send me to die, Mr. Garrett." Emma's voice was quiet but steady. "You sent me away because you were afraid of being wrong. My grandmother said a man who can't be wrong can't learn. She was right about that, too." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. He removed his coat, heavy wool lined with fur, the warmest garment he owned. He walked to Emma and wrapped it around her shoulders. She was so small inside it, 11 years old and thin from a winter of rationed food that it hung nearly to her ankles. "I was wrong," Henry said. Each word felt like pulling out a tooth. "I sent you out because I thought you were lying. I thought I knew weather better than an 11-year-old girl with her grandmother's stories." He looked at the boiler behind her, at the seals of mud and grass still visible around the firebox door, at the iron shell that should have been her coffin but became her salvation. "Your grandmother knew things I don't understand." Emma's expression softened slightly. "The others," she said. "At the schoolhouse. Are they?" Henry's face told her before his words did. Some lived, some didn't. He watched Emma's eyes close, watched her process what that meant. Peter Morgan died 200 yards from the school door. He couldn't see it in the white. Henry paused. Sarah Lindgren died in a haystack with Miss Ashford. She was 6 years old. Emma's breath caught. She'd known Sarah. They'd played together at recess. "Miss Ashford says she should have listened to you." Henry's voice broke on the words. "She says you tried to warn us." Emma said nothing. "The whole township will know." "I'll tell them myself." Henry lifted Annie into his arms. The little girl was too weak to ride alone. The Hayes girl saw the storm when I couldn't. I punished her for it. She lived because she's smarter than an old man with 9 winters experience. He helped William and Kate onto his horse. Emma walked beside them wrapped in Henry's coat, her feet leaving small prints in the snow. They didn't speak again until they reached the farm. Mrs. Rachel Clark arrived at the Garrett farmhouse at the 10:30. She'd spent the night alone in her cabin watching the storm pound against walls that seemed far too thin. Her 3 children had been walking home when the white wall hit. She'd had no way to search, no way to know if they were alive or dead. When the storm broke, she'd run to the Garrett farm, the nearest neighbor, hoping for news, fearing the worst. She'd prepared herself to learn that her children were frozen in a drift somewhere, that she'd have to bury them beside their father, that she'd be alone. What she found instead was Emma Hayes sitting at the Garrett kitchen table with bandaged hands and a cup of hot coffee, watching over 3 sleeping children bundled in quilts. Her children. Rachel stopped in the doorway. She looked at William, at Kate, at Annie. Alive. All of them, though Annie's feet were wrapped in rags and Kate's fingers were blackened. She looked at Emma. Emma met her eyes and said nothing. They were in the storm, Rachel said. Her voice was flat, unreadable. How they found me. Emma answered. Her voice was steady. I was in the boiler, in the ravine. I sealed it against the wind. They knocked. I let them in. The boiler. Rachel repeated the word like it was foreign. The old thresher boiler. Yes, you let them in. They knocked. Rachel stood there for a long moment. Her face worked through emotions Emma couldn't read. Relief, confusion, something that might have been shame. The woman who had said good riddance to the Hayes girl was looking at the girl who had saved her children. Rachel didn't apologize, didn't thank Emma. She walked to her children, gathered them in her arms, and held them so tightly that Kate whimpered. When she finally spoke again, she spoke to the room, not to anyone in particular. Annie will lose toes. 2, Emma said quietly. Maybe 3, but she'll walk. Rachel nodded. She lifted Annie, the girl at awake, now groggy but aware, and carried her toward the door. William and Kate followed, leaning on each other, not looking back. At the threshold, Rachel paused. You let them in, she said for the 3rd time. They knocked. Emma answered for the 3rd time. Rachel looked at Emma then, really looked at her. And something passed between them that had no words, only the terrible understanding of debt that could never be repaid. Then she left, taking her children home. Henry stood in the doorway watching them go, watching Rachel Clark carry away 3 lives that would have frozen without the girl Rachel had called trouble. Martha touched his shoulder. 4 lived, she said quietly. That's something. 4 lived. Henry agreed, and 4 died, and I have to learn to carry both. The days that followed were days of counting. Henry helped the township gather the dead. Peter Morgan, Sarah Lindgren, 2 Anderson children, 4 small coffins, 4 funerals, 4 families broken by the storm and by Henry's certainty. At each funeral, Henry stood in the back. He didn't dare sit with the families, didn't dare offer condolences. Everyone knew, the whole township knew. Henry Garrett had said the cold broke. Henry Garrett had told Miss Ashford to send children home early. Emma Hayes had warned them. Henry Garrett had called her a liar. 4 children dead, 13 alive. The arithmetic of pride. 2 weeks after the blizzard, the school board met. Henry stood before 6 other members in the cramped office behind the general store. They asked him to explain what had happened. Henry told the truth. Emma Hayes warned us. I dismissed her. I sent her away without a coat. I told Miss Ashford to send children home early. I was wrong. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, the chairman spoke. Mr. Garrett, you've survived 9 winters here. You're the most experienced man in the township. Why didn't you see it? Henry took a breath. This was the moment, the fulcrum point. He could make excuses, could talk about warm fronts and unusual weather patterns, could spread the blame around, or he could tell the truth. Because I confused experience with wisdom, Henry said. Experience tells you what happened before. Wisdom tells you what might happen next. Emma had wisdom from her grandmother. I had experience and pride. Pride told me I couldn't be wrong in front of children, couldn't look weak in front of the township. So I chose being certain over being safe, and children died for it. The room fell silent. I'm resigning from the school board, Henry continued. Effective immediately. I don't deserve the authority I abused. The chairman started to protest, but Henry held up his hand. A man who kills children with his certainty shouldn't be trusted with their education. He walked out of that meeting with his head high, but his soul crushed. In March, when the first thaw came, Henry went to the ravine. Emma was already there, standing in front of the boiler, looking at it like it was a shrine. Henry approached slowly. She turned when she heard his boots in the melting snow. "I never properly thanked you," Henry said. "For what?" Emma asked. "I saved myself. For saving me from having to live with 18 deaths instead of 4. Emma turned back to the boiler. "4 is still too many, Mr. Garrett." "I know." Henry felt the weight of those 4 graves like stones in his chest. "I'll live with those 4 deaths until the day I die. But because of you, it's only 4, not 18. You gave me a chance to live with smaller guilt." Emma looked at him then. "Guilt can't be erased, Mr. Garrett. My grandmother said that. It can only be learned from. Have you learned anything?" Henry nodded slowly. "I learned that a man can survive 9 winters and still not understand winter. That an 11-year-old girl can see a storm coming that a man with experience misses. Because you listen to someone who survives storms, and I only listen to myself." He took a breath. "I learned that experience isn't wisdom, that reputation isn't truth, that authority doesn't give me the right to be wrong." "What will you do with that lesson?" Emma asked. "Teach it to anyone who'll listen, and live so that those 4 deaths aren't meaningless." Emma studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded just once. "That's all we can do, Mr. Garrett. Live with what we've done, and try to be better." They stood together in silence, looking at the iron boiler that had saved 4 lives while 4 others froze. The years that followed changed Henry Garrett in ways the township noticed but rarely discussed. He traveled Gerald County teaching about emergency shelters, boilers, train cars, mining equipment, anything with iron walls thick enough to block wind and mass enough to hold heat. He never took credit, never asked for payment. Just said, "An 11-year-old saved my life. I'm passing it on." When the Easter blizzard hit in 1891, fewer children died. Families knew where to run because of the Hayes method, though Emma herself never called it that. In 1896, Emma married Eric Dahl, a Norwegian farmer. Henry attended the wedding and brought her a gift. Her grandmother's primstav, the Norwegian calendar stick with weather symbols carved into the wood. Henry had found it in Emma's room at his farm the day after the storm kept it safe repaired. It maintained it for 8 years. "Your grandmother's wisdom saved lives," he told Emma. "It should stay with you." Emma accepted it with tears in her eyes. Henry became known in the township as the man who listens instead of the man who knows. When people asked him about weather, he'd ask them first, "What do you see? What does your grandmother's knowledge say?" He never stopped carrying the guilt of those 4 deaths, but he learned to carry it in a way that honored them instead of just crushing him. Now sitting in his kitchen in January 1918, 82 years old and telling the story to his grandson James, Henry reached the end. James sat in silence for a long moment. "Grandpa," the boy finally said, "you said you killed children with your certainty, but you also saved 13 by admitting you were wrong. Doesn't that balance?" Henry shook his head slowly. "James, when you reach my age, you'll learn a cruel lesson. The good things we do don't erase the bad things. They live parallel. I saved 13 by admitting I was wrong. Yes, but I still killed 4 with my pride. Both are true. Both are my legacy. I can't choose to remember only the good." He looked at his grandson. "The best a man can do isn't to avoid mistakes. It's to live with his mistakes in a way that teaches something." "What's the lesson?" James asked. Henry looked out the window at the warm January morning that felt so much like that other morning 30 years ago. "The lesson is this. When an 11-year-old tells you that wolves are chasing the sun, don't ask how she knows. Ask what we should do about it. The lesson is that authority comes from admitting wrong, not pretending to be right. The lesson is that a man's greatest legacy isn't what he knew. It's what he learned and then taught to others." James nodded slowly. Then he asked, "So should I take my coat?" Henry smiled, the first real smile in the entire telling. "What do you think?" James looked out the window. "Sky's too clear. After a week of cold, this warmth feels wrong." "Then trust your instincts," Henry said. "Take the coat. Better to carry it and not need it than need it and not have it." James stood, retrieved his coat from the hook by the door and put it on. Henry watched him with something like pride. "One more thing, James. If you see sundogs today, lights beside the sun, don't dismiss them. Emma Hayes saw them 30 years ago. She was right. I was wrong. Don't be me, James promised. Then he left for school, properly dressed, properly warned. Henry sat alone in his kitchen watching through the window as his grandson walked down the road. That afternoon, Emma Dahl came to visit. She was 41 now, her hair showing threads of gray, her fingers still missing their tips from frostbite 30 years past. She walked with a slight limp on cold mornings, but her eyes were still sharp, still Norwegian, still holding her grandmother's wisdom. They sat by the fire drinking coffee in comfortable silence. I heard you tell James about the blizzard, Emma said finally. You heard enough to know you still carry it. Henry nodded. 30 years, Emma. 4 small coffins. I still see them. Emma's voice was gentle. Mr. Garrett, I see them too. I see Peter Morgan every time snow falls. I see Sarah Lindgren every time children laugh. Not because I killed them, because I couldn't save them. Henry looked up. But you saved 4 people. I killed 4 people. No, Emma said firmly. The storm killed them. You just didn't prevent it. There's a difference. You forgive too easily. Not forgiveness, Mr. Garrett. Acceptance. There's a difference in that too. Henry felt something loosen in his chest. Do you regret it, trying to warn us even though no one believed you? Every day, Emma admitted. I regret not shouting louder, not making them listen. But my grandmother taught me you can't force people to hear truth. You can only speak it in hope. Your grandmother was very wise. Yes, and so are you now, because you learn. Too late, but still learn. And taught it to James. He won't make your mistake. That's legacy. Henry and Emma sat in silence as the afternoon light faded. Outside the window, sundogs appeared. 2 bright spots flanking the pale winter sun. Emma saw them first. Pointed. Henry looked, nodded. Both stood. I'll call Martha. Henry said, close the windows. Check the livestock. I'll warn the town, Emma said. 3 hours before the storm. This time they'll listen, Henry said. This time they know the price of not listening. Emma agreed. She left. Henry stood at his window watching the sundogs chase the sun across the winter sky. He died in 1920 at the age of 84. His gravestone didn't mention 9 Dakota winters or his time on the school board. It simply read, Henry Garrett, 1836 to 1920. He learned to listen. That was all a man could hope for. To be remembered not for what he knew, but for what he learned. Emma Hayes taught him that. An 11-year-old girl taught a 52-year-old man. And he spent 30 years trying to be worthy of the lesson. In the end, he told the story one last time to his grandson on a warm January morning. Passed the warning down, taught the price of pride and the value of wisdom. The wolves still chase the sun sometimes. But now when they do, people listen to the children who see them coming. And that Henry understood in his final years was the only redemption a man like him could ever earn. Not forgiveness, just the chance to prevent his mistake from happening again. The iron boiler sat in that ravine until 1918, when it was finally hauled away for scrap metal to support the war effort. By then, everyone in Gerald County knew its story. The story of 4 children who survived because an 11-year-old girl knew that iron holds heat like stone holds memory. And the story of a man who learned too late for some, but not too late for others, that the ones who see the storm coming are the only ones who survive it.